Okay, you ready? Do you hear anything? Okay, can you hear me? All right.
Okay. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Hey, guys. Okay, this is Mike Masterson with the Reynolds Company here in Houston. We're going to get started with our September users group. Thanks for everyone who's here. First of all, I guess by a show of hands, is everyone aware that Rockwell is having their automation fair in November? Who's going? Yay! Well, I have some Okay, great. This is all good. Just to let you know what it is, this is Rockwell's largest trade show they have. This is basically where we get to see stuff that we're going to see next year for real. I like going to it because actually everything I've told you this year that you should be seeing next year, if it's not there at Automation Fair, then I have lied to you. So hopefully it's all going to be shown there. It's November 20th and 21st is the actual Automation Fair. And the 18th and 19th, the Monday and Tuesday before that, is the Process System Users Group. That is a pay class or a pay seminar to go to. Automation Fair is free. I have some flyers on it. Feel free to come up and grab one if you have any questions on it. We do have hotel packages. We're not doing airfare out of the office, but we do have hotel space booked. So feel free to get with me, and if you're online listening to this, you can go to our website or just search Rockwell Automation Fair, and you should be able to see the registration information. I will say one more time, it's the best trade show that Rockwell has. So if you can make it, please do. Now to get started, today we're talking about ThinManager, which is a Rockwell software that some of you might have exposure to. And we're also going to be going over Factory Talk AssetCentre. This is not going to be a real slide-heavy day, so we're not going to PowerPoint you to death. We do have some demos that worked this morning, so we're pretty sure they're going to work today. But these things are always kind of iffy. So we're going to give it a shot. So ThinManager is the way we provide content. Oh, okay. Just want to make sure. All right. ThinManager is our software package for delivering content in our HMI system. This is our FactoryTalk View SE distributed system. Many of you have used FactoryTalk View before. Many of you are familiar with Machine Edition, which is basically what a panel view is. That can be run on a panel view or a standard screen, or FactoryTalk View Standalone, which is basically a standalone station. Currently, we've been trying to push a lot more client server, and ThinManager actually gives us the ability to actually control the content going out. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And the content you see here, these various sources here, we have some that will be using remote desktop, and we have some that will be shadowing VNC like you would do with, let's say, a Panel View Plus. We can also use Microsoft OS systems too. We have an application, WinTMC, which can be put on a Microsoft box and still work also. So our traditional control rooms that we've seen take up a lot of resources. It almost makes me wish I was selling the PC boxes instead of the software part of it. Typically, we have our operating systems, our application files, antivirus, moving parts, and then USB access. We have that for one system. Then we add it for all these systems. So what's the pain point with this? I'll take suggestions from you guys. Well, for one thing, just maintaining each one as a separate facility. Let's take a look at the issues with network security on it. Each one is separate. Virus software. Each one of these have to be touched separately. So what we've been promoting is more of a client-server type architecture. Everything residing on the server or duplicate servers, then using relatively inexpensive zero client boxes. That's where we are trending, where we're going with this. So the way it works is our devices, when they're hooked up, are going to go out and pull and ask for what type of information you're going to need at your terminal. So the firmware is delivered to the client. I believe it's like a 15 meg file, so it takes a half second to get delivered to the terminal. It doesn't really take any time to do this. Then the customer profile is delivered, and there's a couple ways we can do this. Is it based on login credentials? Are we using, let's say, a QR code? Are we geofencing it using GPS? That's how we decide what information gets to that customer. And then the content is delivered. So that one person, that engineer, is always going to get his screen that he needs for that section of the plant.
And the big benefit on this one is once you decide what content you're getting, you're not having to deal with where the content is coming from and installing the software on every single box. It could be defined by the location, by the user. So every single time you can be getting different content, and you can also do it from third-party systems.
Yes, this is an open architecture. There's many a wonderware system that is running this ThinManager software. So we're agnostic to the actual HMI system. Keep that in mind. Not that we're grasping here stuff, but this software is good for other uses also. So typically on the, it also makes it very easy to set up for a failover and a redundancy package. As far as redundancy, what it is basically is it's a licensing part. Basically, you're licensing it for a redundant package. And the content's delivered, and the content will follow you around based on how you set it up. Okay, whoops, did I go back too many slides? Okay, certain things we're doing. If you go look at our sample system or demo system we have out here, we're actually using ThinManager software. If you notice, we have the screen quadded. out. So we're able to quad or tile the screens. And in this case, our TV out there, we're doing 4 screens off of it. We can also mirror a panel view using VNC. So, and bring that content. We can also use multi-monitor, up to 5 monitors. And again, now we can introduce an outside video source for security, or if we're having a camera on something for condition monitoring purposes, that can be added into it also. And this is real simple, easy, fast setup. And also something fairly new to me is virtual screening. Where this is different from tile is these are all, what you're seeing here is actually 4 different sessions running on the same screen at the same time. It's not click and expand, you're just seeing the 4 different sources. And in this case, I think what we're running in is we're running 2 SE applications, maybe a trending software, and we're also running a factory talk view ME all on one screen. Okay, you want to talk a little bit about this, Luis?
What we're doing here is, so we call it relevance. So if any of you are familiar with ThinManager, we've called it relevance users. That's really just the mobility part of it. It's already built into ThinManager. But what you'll see is you'll get to choose where the content is coming from. So Mike mentioned geofencing. So that's either Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS. So like if you have content, you're on an iPad, you get close to something, you can automatically get a session onto the iPad, and as you walk away, they'll automatically get logged out. As you start looking at also a couple of the examples and what's on the demo box, there is a little RFIDs. Basically, you take your RFID badge scan in that you usually use at the office, tie that into your user access. So now you not only have your username and password, but you also have it where it's your 2-factor authentication, where you have to be in front of the machine, in front of the skid to be able to do anything. So all of that is enabled as part of that user content.
It's a good way to adding onto your security, not just relying on your Microsoft security. It gives you another way to do it, what works in your plant. It could be anything from putting QR codes on particular skids, so someone walking around with an iPad can scan the QR code and bring up exactly what displays he needs for that operation.
And what you can see from the picture is under the user content there, if you're logged in as either maintenance or administrator, you might want to be able to get into the code. So at that point, it's showing you Studio 5000 in the same environment that you would have been looking at HMI, but it's not both installed on the same box. Everything is coming from the servers.
Just some examples of some of the things we can use. Again, currently we're using QR code. They are working on facial recognition. It's not in the release yet, but actually I still think that's supposed to be an add-on to version 11, which is what we're at now. So that is coming in the near future.
And if any of you have gone or will be planning to go to Automation Fair, they usually have a good setup on this where they're showing all the different features. In the past, they've done the Vuzix AR glasses. They've also done the Microsoft HoloLens. So both of those are apps that get installed where it's basically just the ThinManager app launched on those setups. So.
Okay. These are different aspects of the mobility. The biggest thing is on this takeaway is ThinManager, before it was integrated into the Rockwell product line, used its own licensing. We now have moved it to a factory talk licensing scheme. So we don't have the headaches that we possibly might have had before with the old licensing.
If you're not using a Rockwell product, you can still use the old licensing that existed previously before Rockwell acquired ThinManager. So, yeah. So, and there are some of those customers out there that maybe they're using it on DCSs or something else. So you can use that non-factory talk licensing if you still want to do that. We're maintaining both licenses going forward.
So our sample architectures, if any of you have put any of our SE systems together, it's easy to say you just buy an SE package, but there's a lot of software in how all this stuff goes together. These are our typical configs for a small 10 terminals, 20 terminals, and 50 terminals. As you see, as you get larger, things get more involved in what you need, and this isn't really addressing even the way the servers are set up. So it can get fairly complicated, but this is a good test of how our typical systems would be set up, any of our SE distributed systems. So it shouldn't be a surprise to most of you who have worked with this before. So. Okay, now this is looking at some of our competitors. One thing you notice that Citrix and Dell Weiss will tell you, or they will say they do basically the same thing as ThinManager, but they're mainly based on the server side of the application, not the client side. We have all the hooks for the geofencing built into it, which they don't have as part of the solution. So we're the only ones who are really approaching the industrial environment. The others, that's just their enterprise system, a standard one. It doesn't really look at our unique needs out in the field.
Yeah, one of the things Mike mentioned is, so it's a content delivery system, so it doesn't matter what the content is. Anything that's part of the control system, whether it's the servers, the HMIs, the reporting software, or even the panel views and things of that nature, all of that is content that can be delivered to the devices. The big differentiation on the ThinManager side is the actual device itself is something that we're managing. So when we look at Citrix, Dell Weiss, to Mike's point, that's all server-based. So in most cases, it's just a user, and it provides you the window into Windows. So you get your start, you get a chance to, almost like just a standard remote desktop. Whereas on this, we're managing the end device. Whether it's an iPad, whether it's a thin client, that environment, that box is what we're managing. And at that level, you can set up the mobility, who's logging in, and the different content, and that can be assigned ahead of time, and then you can also set up policies. So it's really easy to replace a unit when you're out in the field without having to do any configuration to the actual units, and you don't have to save anything to the actual units. So that's a big difference on what you would see from a standard, either Citrix or Dell Weiss, where it's usually at that point, it's more IT based. You're just launching a new image set.
Okay, and part of the new licensing agreement, this is something Rockwell hasn't done traditionally. Basically, we're offering you, the customers are being offered volume licensing now. So it is a quantity-based type system now. So you see, as you get larger, the discount applies. And I know this is really a marketing class, and we're not talking about the price, but where I'm going with this is, let me go backwards. We're now able to divide up the actual number of stations to anywhere you want. So if you buy 100 stations, those could be 100 different sites if you wanted to. Where traditionally, where we sold the ThinManager in 5-pack increments or 10 or 25-pack, and they were generally tied to the site, not very flexible. So this allows us to break it down. This is actually a big deal for the people who are currently using it, and makes life easier when trying to figure out how to deploy this.
Yeah, so one of the biggest asks that we would always get is, so we settle it in, and to Mike's point, we sold it in a 5-pack. So the smallest number of devices that you can manage was a 5-pack, but if you had a single or a dual that you just needed, you had to get the 5-pack, and you just had extra licensing attached to it. So now you can go down and buy just one single one. So if you're just doing a smaller segment and you want to grow over time, you just add more licensing to it, just like you do anything else on the Rockwell side.
So if I just bought a 5-pack,
Send us, yeah, we'll talk, and we'll figure out how to do a swap over.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did the swap on our end as of October 28th or so.
Yeah,
or
and I just actually
September.
was working on a job 2 weeks ago where I had to do the same thing. So it can be done. All right. now the gotchas. Whenever you put this stuff together, I know this from personal experience now, having just worked on a job, is you need Microsoft licensing behind this to make yourself legal. Just remember, from the most part, we are not including the remote desktop CALs. So those have to be added to the job. Just to let you know, we as the Reynolds companies, we do have access to the CALs. We do volume licensing, so if you do need them, let us know. It's not a money maker for us, but as a convenience, we can always offer it for you.
So if you guys aren't familiar, CAL is a client access license on the Windows side of it. So the idea is when you're using a workstation from Windows, let's say Windows 7, Windows 10, if you remote desktop into that, it black screens because you can only have one session running at a time. But when you're looking at a server environment, so Windows Server 2016, for example, if somebody else, so if 2 users log into the exact same server and do remote desktop, both of them have an independent session. By default, each one comes essentially with the number of CALs is the number of connections that you can do. So as you start building this out, the difference here is normally you would have to buy little Dell workstation boxes, install all the equipment, do the antivirus, the USB keys, the security, like Mike mentioned at the beginning of it. So your entire facility might have 10 to 20 of these computers all running FactoryTalk View SC client. If one of them died out in the field, you basically have to take a new computer, reinstall all the software, and it takes you a couple hours to get it back up and running to where you were. The environment here is running everything off of a server environment. So now you set up one Windows 2016 image with all the software that's running on it. And all we're essentially doing is remote desktoping into that one box. So all the sessions, all the devices and thin clients are all creating a single session to that one box, and that's the only box that you really have to maintain. But what you do have to do is for the number of devices, the number of clients that are going to be accessing it, you need to buy the appropriate Windows licensing because Microsoft on that side of it wants to make sure that they're covering their basis on the kind of Microsoft EULA for the number of users that you're tying into. So you can support Linux, but the actual ThinManager itself is Windows-based. So from a virtual environment and from what you can present, the Thin client can load up a Linux box on it, but the actual environment doesn't have a Linux.
Right. Okay.
So as far as, so like an example of that guy over there. So Mike mentioned there's the multi-monitor and then also the virtual screening. So if you tile it, so think of like IP cameras, I can have 25 independent IP cameras, independent sessions on one monitor, and that's essentially one connection. Now with the virtual screening, I can do 4 separations of that 25 each. I would never want you to do that, but you can. So think of a big, kind of the benefit there is a 4K monitor. The 4K monitor basically just means it's 4 HD displays in one. So I can do where it's usually you're designing all your HMIs to like 1920 by 1080p. It's 4 of those. So 4K can be split up into that 4 independent sessions, but if you wanted a tile inside of that, you can do more than that. I'll be talking about licensing, but essentially on the Rockwell side, that's one license. So no matter how many sessions, you just need the bandwidth to handle how much you're actually displaying. And you guys have to make the decision, does it work for the operators that are trying to do something if all of a sudden I'm creating like these little screens? So, but you'll see once we get into the demo and you guys can see it, what ThinManager does is it automatically scales everything. So it doesn't matter what resolution you're presenting it on, whatever you give it, it scales to it.
Now, I think most of the people in this session here currently are more of the integrator world. And I just want to point out, when it comes to the Microsoft licensing, instead of employing it, if you talk to your customers, a lot of times their internal IT departments want to pull from their own volume licenses for RDSs. That helps them keep track of it. Always ask that question before you automatically assume you're going to supply them. A lot of times it's more convenient for the customers to use their own internal volume licensing than for you to provide it. Just questions to ask, because this is kind of a gotcha that people forget towards the end of the process. That's it.
And
Ready
no,
to talk
you're not allowed
a
to
little
leave yet. It's
demo.
my turn.
Any questions on this? This was a kind of a brief overview before we go into more detail on this, but we're going to do the labs at the very end.
Yeah. Yeah, David yelled at us, if we try to do the demos and mess up his system, he's going to get mad. Go for it. Mhm.
Is that loaded with a
Good.
that what's allowing you to be able to switch strings up?
So all of the, it's not, because it doesn't have to be. So what you'll see on our end, and what is also a little different, is we call them a zero client. So if you've seen those, basically a zero client means there's no Windows interface, and realistically there's no operating system on the thin client environment itself. So the box that we're using inside of that demo, all it asks for is the IP address for ThinManager. It will automatically connect, especially if you're routing based off the switches. It'll get its profile, gets the file, but everything is coming from the server.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're basically streaming it to the environment, which is also nice because you don't need to have as much bandwidth when it comes to connecting into it. Yeah. Yeah.
Nothing. I mean, we seriously don't require anything at all.
Because the difference was in the past, in most cases, for anybody that's tried to do a quad monitor setup on a traditional computer, you need to get a pretty beefy video card. In most cases, you needed something that can handle either 4 HDMI cables or something to that effect. And if you try to go above 4, all of a sudden you were buying these big, gigantic video cards or special cables. The difference here is because everything is at the server side of it, all you have to do is buy a thin client that can support the amount of connections. So we have one that can do up to 7 4K monitors. And essentially the box is about this big.
Yeah.
So all of the processing power and everything needs to be at the server, not at the thin client.
We do have our own thin clients also, and we pull them out. We want this be more based on software, but we do have 0 clients from single monitor up to 4. So we'll gladly talk to you offline about that.
The thin client doesn't have one essentially.
Yeah.
So it's based off the differences on ours. They're called ThinManager Ready. A ThinManager Ready is tying into the ThinManager software itself. It will run on Windows on that side. So you would install, it's about a 350 meg software package that sits on top of a Windows environment. And that's usually, the way that we usually have it set up is on the remote desktop box or terminal server. Right. At that point, and that would all be at the server side of it.
But that's the thing. Instead of 20 disparate locations, you're doing it all at one centralized location.
So if you've ever looked at a virtual system, and I know we have, in a virtual environment, if you do a remote desktop box and you can provide, let's say, 10 sessions off the same Windows environment, that's only one antivirus setup, and everything would be done at the server. So when you do patching, when you do any of that, it's all done from that one central location. Instead of having to, in the past, you would have to patch every single Windows client, then come back to the server, restart everything, and make sure it all comes back. In this environment, as soon as you patch the main server, every single one of the clients, all you have to do is turn them on and turn them off. But there's no software, there's no patching, and you can also prevent the USB access. So if I tie into a little USB stick on the front of a thin client, it does nothing. By default, the only thing that's enabled is a keyboard and mouse. But you can do it. Yes, it would be tying into either DHCP or you can manually type it in.
And the Windows application is called WinTMC, is a free download off the ThinManager website. So traditionally, that's a lot of stuff. Any Microsoft device, that's where you're going to be running on it.
So we're going to switch gears just a little bit, still talking about software, and then I'll kind of try to tie it back in at the end. So how many of you have played, seen, heard of Factory Talk AssetCentre? half of the room. For anybody that doesn't know, my name is Luis. I'm the solution architect with Rockwell. So that's why I want to burn the shirts. So what you'll see from AssetCentre is it's our change management solution. It is still server-based, so it's going to run Windows 2016 more than likely. And this will be one centralized repository for all of the control system environment. So when I'll talk about assets. Assets for us is basically a smart device with a configuration file. A control logics, a compact logics, a panel view, factory talk view, a static switch. All of those are a smart asset that we want the configuration file. What we do is we save those configuration files in a central repository, and then we do a backup comparison while it's online to the device to see if there's changes between the two databases. So if it sees a control logics file that's running on the controller different from what it finds on its database, it will then upload the latest and greatest, create a new revision, and then send out an email with all of the changes in a PDF format. And it's down to the run level. So you'll see the archive and disaster recovery. So from one central location, you can check files in and out. So you can set security policies in place on how you're doing that. It will also accept third-party files. So we are able to collect from Word, Excel, and then third-party equipment. The way that we handle it is most of the licensing and the upper-end features are going to be very Rockwell-centric. But we have solutions around third-party as well. The other piece is an audit trail. So as we start growing more and more into the kind of the Rockwell environment, down to the HMI level, I can track who's going into an HMI and logging in, changing set points. So all of the button pushes, all the changes from each location, including thin clients. So again, if I have a walk around iPad program, I can see who's logging in, who's making changes from that site. Bless you. Yes. Yeah, so what ends up happening in the background is, for anybody that's installed any of the Factory Talk software, there's always a services platform that ties into it. What AssetCentre does is it grabs all the logs and creates one centralized file. And all of that would get saved into the SQL database. The security side of it is kind of based directly on the Factory Talk side of it. So you can build in the Factory Talk security and those type of implementations directly into AssetCentre. So you're changing the policy. The main idea here is we want to prevent people from taking their USB key or having copies of the file on different laptops, create everything in a centralized spot, and you check the file in and out so you always have the latest and greatest files. Some of the things that you guys will see when we talk about AssetCentre is there's a main AssetCentre server, so that's what houses the database. It uses SQL Express, so that has in the latest version, it's a 10 gig top end. You can buy a full SQL standard license and just continue that size. So that will work. There's an AssetCentre client, which when we show you the demo is the runtime portion of it. That would be either at the server environment or at the local clients. So the local client would be your laptops. So essentially, anytime you check out a file, you're getting it to your local box. AssetCentre itself is read-only. It never writes anything to the controller. But if you think about it, once you check the file out and it's your engineering workstation, whether it's a dedicated client or whether it's your laptop, your license kicks in, you now have a full read-write environment. And that's outside of AssetCentre. AssetCentre is just a tool to be able to get the file in. And then the agent is what does the work in the background. So when I go out from the AssetCentre server to go out to the control logics or the compact logics while it's online to do its work, it's basically using RS links, Factory Talk links, the same environment that you would use using Studio 5000, but it all happens in the background. So, as you start growing into it, basically all we're doing is we're licensing the server and the total number of assets. The agents, the clients, all of that comes with. So you can just expand and make this a bigger system or a smaller system, depending on how you need it. So the standalone to the distributed is the exact same licensing. The only thing that changes is how many overall assets do you have tied into? Is it 50 or is it 5,000? So if we get into the 5,000 realm, we start separating this thing out, adding more pieces of it so that you can do some load balancing. you guys feel free to ask questions. But so what we do, we call it disaster recovery. I call it backup and compare because it usually makes a little bit more sense. Disasters are usually a bad thing in our industry. All this means is you get away from having to name the file with a time and date stamp of when you created it or saying final 1, final 2, final 3. It just has a single name and there's multiple revisions that get saved inside of the SQL database. So if you ever needed to go back a version, so if somebody goes out, does work, or if it's you guys, and all of a sudden something breaks 1 day, 2 days, 3 days down the road, you now have the backup saved on your system, push that in, and then you can see the comparison and see what differences happen. So go ahead.
No.
It's a system-wide asset management, not only for Rockwell Solutions.
So, but anything connected to an environment that can only from a historization required access, right?
So
Data manual entry for mechanical integrity programs and what procedures, can you add all that in like a proper asset? Is that part of OSHA 9210?
Almost like a condition put your condition monitoring equipment in.
right.
Yes.
So it wouldn't go to that level. So we do have solutions that tie in to get into the work order side of it. This one is more on the physical asset perspective and what it's doing from the configuration side of it. So if it's a work order and I need to be able to tie in to say, okay, something is breaking, this isn't tracking the kind of runtime hours, let's say. Yeah, we have the ability on the Rockwell side to be able to kind of tie that into a bigger system all the way up through ERP or whatever one might do on that side of it. What this does is as it starts tracking, like to your point on the historian side, when we start looking at that, we would pair that with a historian system and then give you a reporting software that ties into all of it. So no, on our end, it'd just be like a vantage point. So that's usually the typical setups that I look at from architecture would be AssetCentre, historian, and vantage point. So now you're collecting all of the asset information and all the configuration from your control side of it. Then you're also looking at the process information. So how, for 3 years, I want to see all the process variables on historian. And then on the reporting side of it, I want to check to see who's checked my files out, what the audits look like for an 8-hour shift. And then also, if something happens, I want to see the alarms in 30 minutes before and 30 minutes after and show them all on the screen. We can, but not with this system. On the Rockwell side, we can. There's other stuff that does that. One other thing that comes with the audits is, so this becomes powerful because again, it's kind of like a big brother. I don't know how many of you guys have done it, but in the past, if I went to go troubleshoot something, what I would do is log into Studio 5000, tie in, make a couple of rung edits, put it back exactly how it was after I was done testing, and then I was done. To a standard system, if I'm doing a comparison between the control logics file and what I have in the database, that is not a change because I put it back exactly how it was. The audit trail, on the other hand, is tracking every single thing that I did and from what laptop I did it. So that becomes kind of the differentiation side of it where it's looking at the time and date stamp, it's looking at the computer and the actual location that it was done on, who was logged in at the time, and then what changes happened. You have to have the AssetCentre client or tied into it. So the idea here is, imagine the rogue laptop idea. You have the full system, you have AssetCentre on top, everything is being tracked, and then the rogue integrator comes in, plugs in an Ethernet card into the control logics chassis, gets into the controller and starts making modifications. So that could be the system integrator, that can be the OEM. What AssetCentre would do is track all the changes that are happening at the controller side of it, but it wouldn't be able to see the audits of the actual changes. So as you start seeing this, this is part of the kind of security policy that needs to be in place. Who has access to the information and how far do you have to lock down the controller? Because that takes an extra step as well. But what it would do is AssetCentre, whenever a controller sees changes, it can send a flag to AssetCentre saying somebody is making modifications to my code. If they're not part of the kind of AssetCentre FactoryTalk family because it's a temporary user or guest user, the controller will at least notify AssetCentre saying there is a change that's happening. You need to be aware of it. It may not be able to track all of the audits until the next time it does a backup. Yeah, the remote desktop's usually going to be a little bit easier because of the fact that if you're remoting desktop, you're already in the system. So you would want it, like if you do a jump box to get into Studio 5000, you would want the AssetCentre client installed on that so that no matter who jumps into it, whoever goes into the remote desktop box now is being tracked as part of the system. So that's some stuff that we do as part of like the IDMZ and a couple of the other security pieces that we play into. Does this make sense? One of the later features, I think it was after starting in version 8. So we introduced something called an asset inventory. So traditionally speaking, AssetCentre was as useful as the information that you would provide it. So if it didn't have the controller as part of the kind of configuration, it never knew to go check it. So if you're missing something, you wouldn't be able to see anything. What this now does is it goes out and it scans the network. You have 3 options. One is SIP, which is Common Industrial Protocol, or the equivalent of Ethernet IP. So basically anything that's on our Ethernet network. You also have the switches, so you can do SNMP switches, and you can see all the different switches that are on there. And then you can also do what's called WIMS, which is basically a Windows inventory on the software side of it. So you can do 3 separate scans and bring all of that information back into AssetCentre. So if you find everything on your Ethernet side, so anything that's Ethernet IP, control net, or device net, so think of a sniffer that'll go out through the network, go down through the levels of your bridging network and find all of the serial numbers, all of the firmware that you have, all of the IO cards. All of that would be brought back into AssetCentre, and you can do 2 things with it. If you find any assets that don't currently exist, you can then add them into your tree as your assets, and now you're saved. Or you can also rescan this, let's say once a week, to see if any modifications have happened to your actual network. Did somebody go in there and turn things off? Did somebody add something all of a sudden to your system? So all of that would be part, and that now becomes part of the same disaster recovery mantra. So a couple of updates. This was last year, so version 8. One of the big things that we added is for that asset inventory that I talked about, you can now also tie that into the PCDC site. So if any of you have gone to our download site, the Product Compatibility and Download Center, you can now see the life cycle status of everything that you have inside of AssetCentre.
So all of you are still trying to maintain a Micrologix 1500.
Yeah.
It will tell you stop doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So time to upgrade.
So the caveat on this, obviously, is that you need internet access to your AssetCentre. I can count the number of customers I have in one hand that have that. There is an offline file option. So anything that you scan out using the asset inventory, there's an export feature. That file can be uploaded directly into the PCDC website, and that will give you an offline representation of everything there, life cycle status. So that's telling you whether it's active, active mature, or if it's bloody red and you need to kind of get rid of it and replace it. The latest option that we have right now for AssetCentre is version 9. It now supports Windows 2016, so that would be our default version that we'd look at for you guys to install. As you can see, there's quite a few things that got in here because of the fact that we're talking about ThinManager and FactoryTalk View. One of the big updates that we did is we now have FactoryTalk View SE as an asset. So in the past, what we've had to do is create a binder around the folder structure and essentially just add the entire folder into AssetCentre. And FactoryTalk View SE and the static switches are now available assets. All you need is a Rockwell license to be able to do that backup and compare. All of those will show up. So as part of the demo, we'll kind of show some of the tie-ins. The other big piece that's here is now when you do the asset inventory and you want to see the life cycle side of it, you will go down all the way to the IO cards. So the last release was just at the controller level for the life cycle. Now it's down to the IO cards as well. Mhm. Mhm.
Is it possible then for us to work and go backwards on those versions? We're trying to get these people from like 10 to 9. And then like that.
So that won't.
No, isn't it? No, you can, or no, it's not possible.
No, I know what you're talking about. Essentially, for the people on the phone, when you install FactoryTalk View, you can only have one version at a time on each computer. So if you're doing multiple versions, what AssetCentre would do is it would allow you to save the different versions without doing a configuration change. So if you had a backup of a V9, a V10, and a V11 application, all of it would get saved, but it would not change anything when it comes to exactly. There's some super secret ways of trying to go back, but it's usually not worth the trouble. Right. So I've in my past had to go back to older versions of FactoryTalk View SE, and I've also had to do older versions of Studio 5000, or at the time, Ars Logix 5000, where there's a will, there's a way, but in most cases, it's not worth the effort. But there is a way. Yes, have a backup. That's the key there. So a couple of things, just so you guys are aware, as far as sizing this. Traditionally speaking, if you're talking about 250 to 500 assets, that's the total number that you're looking at. More than likely, you have one AssetCentre server with the client installed on it and the agent installed on it, and that's probably all you have other than more clients. Because from a low-end perspective, one agent can scan out about, on average, we're looking at about, 12? It's 10 assets per hour. So about 120 to 200 assets per day on just a schedule change. So more than likely, you're not scanning every single one of these every day. So that's how we start scaling the agents. We have a knowledge base article that kind of walks through how we would handle critical assets, how we would handle kind of the scanning on it. But what we're looking at, generally speaking, is about 10 assets. So 10 ControlLogix chassis that I'm going to hit in an hour to do a backup and comparison. If I need to do more at the same time, I would just simply add more agents. And like I said, there's no cost for the agents. It's just another Windows box. So an agent needs to be installed either on a Windows 10 box or a Windows Server box. And like, or image. It can all be virtualized. The idea here is all it's doing is, like I said, it's FactoryTalk links or artist links in the background. So it needs to have Studio 5000 installed. It does not need to be licensed. As far as how big this can get, up to 100 clients running all at the same time. So if you can imagine, that could be multiple clients installed out there. It just at the same time, and the max is really 100, and it's not a hard limit. So I'm not going to cut it off at a 101. It just, at that point, I say, okay, you know what you're doing. Agents, we can now go up to 35 agents. So like I said, there's a big difference when I start talking about 100 assets versus 5,000 assets. So if you guys are going past the 100, 200 mark, just talk to us. We can kind of work you through what the architecture would look like on a bigger system like that. And then obviously, we would support, as part of one FactoryTalk directory, one FactoryTalk application set, one AssetCentre server. There is, I don't think I have it in here, but there is also a web component to this. So the client can be, while it's read-only, so I can see just the reports on it, HTML5. So if I wanted to, that would be another client that I can look at that would be separate than the standard installs. So as far as what it can support, 2016 all the way back to 2008, when it comes to servers, your standard web client functionality, and then the SQL side of it also down to 2008. By default, we would install 2016. It comes with Express. If you want the standard edition for the full amount of capacity that you can do on this, it would just be a license fee. You tell us about it, or you tell Reynolds about it, we'll put that in. Any questions?
Two questions. One is on the, Studio 5000, actually, on AssetCentre, provide you with working modifications or nothing is thrown over your application.
So,
We have a team of people working on a project.
exactly. So the way it works is the back, I think somebody's asking a question. The backup and comparison tool, what it does is when it goes out to a control objects and it finds a change, it's automatically opening up the compare and merge tool in the background. So if you guys have ever played around with that in Studio 5000, there's a bunch of tools that almost everybody ignores, but there's about 20 different tools, including like the clock update tool and things of that nature. One of them is a compare and merge. If you launch that manually and you want to use it for your own benefit, you can do up to 3 ACD files at one time, merge it into one. And you can pick and choose what wins. So if you want to steal the UDTs from one, the AOIs from another, the routines from another, you can mix and match and then creates one ACD file. From a development point of view, one controller can support up to 5 instances of Studio 5000 connected at the same time. I don't always recommend that unless you guys know exactly who's working on what. But when they are making multiple changes, you can do that designation and just say, okay, you work on this, I'll work on this, I'll work on this, and then just merge it all together into one final system. The other thing that I'll mention is inside of AssetCentre, what it allows you to do is it's doing a comparison on the latest file in the database to what's in the controller. If you start making modifications and say, I'm going to test something, you can choose to pin the latest version, check the file out, start making modifications, and save a revision 10 when there was already a revision 9, and ignore that when it comes to the comparison, but use that as my working file to make modifications. Once I'm ready for it, I push it into the controller, then I remove the pin and promote the newer version that I had in there. You have a lot of flexibility in doing that. You also have the ability to ignore if somebody checked the file out, because what it does is when you check the file out, it locks everybody else out. The whole point is one person is making changes. I don't want anybody else to do it. That person goes home, they forget to check in, they get sick, whatever the case might be. If you're an administrator, you can go in there and either ignore what they did, or you can still get a workable copy. So you have a lot of flexibility there. The whole point is to be able to monitor and maintain who has access to what.
The second one is as far as the AssetCentre, it seems to me that you're utilizing some of the techniques for monitoring traffic on the network for cyber analysis. Does this product have a IEC 6443 monitoring or passive monitoring capability?
That would be a good question for me to yell at people because I've been asking for that. So roadmap, yes, that is kind of where AssetCentre will eventually kind of play into it. When you look at our documentation for the 62443 on the cybersecurity side of it, both hygiene, Plant PX, anything that you might look at, AssetCentre plays a huge part of the detect. Because while we're not necessarily preventing anybody from doing anything with AssetCentre, we're definitely monitoring and maintaining to see who did something. And also the most important part, how do I recover? Because that's the whole big point of AssetCentre is the disaster recovery piece. If something dies, if somebody goes in and you lose the controllers, you blue screen on a computer that's out there, you have all of the backups in one central spot. And across multiple systems.
And that's why you should be at Automation Fair November 20th and 21st to ask the product managers those specific questions.
So the other thing also, just to be aware of it, while this one does a lot of the assets, it doesn't necessarily look at network traffic. So we do have another product called FactoryTalk Network Manager. So for anybody that has a toolkit, you guys have a license for FactoryTalk Network Manager. It allows you to configure and monitor the static switches. So you can then see a full topology of your entire network, including down to the controllers and the I/O. And now it can also bridge through the backplane. So you can see DLR rings, you can see through an Ethernet drop to another network, but all of that will give you alerts and also an inventory on it. So we have those two kind of tools, one for the networking side and one for the control side of it. So eventually we're trying to figure out a way to be able to kind of show that properly. While all of the documentation around cybersecurity is around all of those products. Me too.
Me too. We'll talk
You need
about
to
that
click on it
next
'cause-
users group. We're trying to come up with a good message because believe me, when they hit us with it, it was kind of confusing.
So yeah, to his point, we're going to be rolling that out as we get more information as to how it's going to really affect you guys. But you guys have seen it from us. We're moving to kind of a subscription and perpetual model. So we have a website now for the software. Toolkits. The toolkits are, all that's changing is now they're not going to be called toolkits anymore. They're going to be software bundles. So it'll give you guys more flexibility to be able to kind of manage that from a web page environment. You'll be able to see all your users, and now you can assign them the serial number instead of having to always like copy the code and move that around. But we'll get you more information as we see that, because it's going to be throughout, not just for the toolkits, but we'll see that going through the entire system.
We feel your pain.
You're moving my cheese here.
I know.
You're making me grow.
The point is we want to make sure that we don't get rid of your cheese. It just might move around a little bit.
We gave you an extra sandwich for that supplies right now.
A cookie? Really quick, let me check to see if somebody asked. Chris, online, it will, so technically it will work from a cloud server, but I would not recommend it. So reach out to me and send me an email and we can talk through the architecture, because that'll be a little bit more of a discussion than yes or no. Okay, so I'm going to transition to a couple of updates that we've talked about. Some of you have already seen this, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details. FactoryTalk View SE, so when we're looking at the HMI side on the computer-based side, as Mike mentioned, we're typically looking at more of the distributed setup now, especially with what we can do with ThinManager and how we're bundling the licenses on these. We're trying to get more users to kind of use one central HMI server with multiple clients. So as of version 11, there was quite a few updates. I kind of highlighted some of the main ones. As I mentioned, with the tie-in to AssetCentre, FactoryTalk View SE is now an asset. So I just back up the entire SE application. The other thing that I'll show you is all of those audits that I was talking about inside of AssetCentre can now be viewed inside of the HMI without having to open up AssetCentre. So as long as AssetCentre is part of the system, I can tie into it and show you all of the audits that are tied into it. So that example that I was talking about, you get an alarm and I want to see 30 minutes before, 30 minutes after, you can do it directly from the HMI system. You don't need Vantage Point on top of it. So that gives you some flexibility there, especially for smaller systems. What we've done and I'll show it to you, it's called Trend Pro. So for anybody that hasn't used that before, we have the standard trending application inside of SE, and then we have what's called Trend Pro. So as of version, I think it was 9 potentially, we added in the functionality of the Vantage Point report, which is a lot more dynamic, that has more abilities to it. We launched that directly into SE. We've now done tons of updates on it, so that allows you to look at data logs. It allows you to see real-time data, historian information, and now it's also tying into the AssetCentre trending and also events. So I'll kind of talk through that. You can also collect from OSI Pi data. So our FactoryTalk Historian SE is OSI Pi based. We now also can natively talk to OSI Pi. So you don't need necessarily process books or anything else. The HMI itself can do it. As long as it's part of the asset framework. Mm-hmm. We're basically trying to make sure you don't have to use any of it. ThinManager licensing, we will talk about that, but essentially what I'm going to show you is it doesn't matter the number of clients or the number of pieces that you tie into one thin client box. It's one license. And then the other big piece is You guys should be aware of this. Nobody should be using HMI-based alarms anymore that are inside of the tags structure. That was the old method. We now use alarm and events. If they're not using that, or if you're looking at a conversion, talk to us. We can show you the little workaround to get that out of the way pretty easily. The other thing is they've done 2 updates. The little application manager that used to be there is now only for ME, meaning that's only for the panel view side of it. Now the tool that was in place called the distributed SE backup and I think backup tool now does all of it. Anything that's SE will be part of that backup utility, whether it's standalone or distributed. So it's a free tool that's always installed anyway. It gives you more flexibility where you don't have to kind of package things up, and it does all the copy and paste. If you're copying it from one system and moving it to another, it allows you to merge, override, or just install on a brand new server without having to override anything. So there's a lot of functionality that you see there. This will be part of the demo that we show, but this is Trend Pro. So inside of the HMI, you're able to dynamically kind of tie into this. I can isolate the trending. I can overlay it all on top. I can click on it, move it around. I can even see a trace. So the nice functionality here is if I'm looking at something and I want to do a quick little trace of the line and export it into a CSV Excel file, I can do it directly from the HMI. So it's just a button push up here. Here you're seeing what the tags are. The tags can come from different pieces of it. Each one's a pin, like you guys have probably seen in the past. And then what I'm showing here is not only the alarms, but I'm also showing you the information from AssetCentre. So again, the audit logs. Who made a modification? Did somebody acknowledge the alarms? Did somebody change the set point from 70 to 72? All of that would be traced there and would show up on the graphs themselves. So if you click on it, you can see directly onto what you're doing. On this tie-in, the other thing that they're showing here is that if you guys are subscribing to the high performance graphics and the ISA 101, if you want to make sure that everything's kind of grayscaled, we'll allow you to do that in the trend environment itself. So now you can kind of avoid a lot of the kind of pretty colors that we typically look at when it comes to a trend environment. I like this one just because it shows you some of the benefits here. So this gives you kind of the ease of use. You can create a lot of shortcuts inside of Trend Pro. So if you wanted to, you can kind of define what all your trend reports look like from one screen and just drag and drop. Anything that I click on here, even if I didn't configure it ahead of time. So a lot of the times you guys go in and create what all the users want to look at. But a lot of the times you might get the phone call saying, hey, you missed a point on my trend. I want to see about adding it. You don't have to get into the Studio 5 or the Factory Talk View Studio environment. You essentially just have them open up Trend Pro. They can go, they can go directly to where the information is located, whether it's live, historical, or even in the Pi database, and then just drag it in. And as soon as they do that, they have the option of being able to publish and save the report again. So once they do that, they're saving the template directly into their SE environment without ever having to open up the development software. So. It'll automatically add it to the tree that's there. So when they go away and they come back, it'll still be there and they just have to click on that kind of quote unquote report. ThinManager SE licensing. Mike mentioned it. So ThinManager as a version 11 now supports the Factory Talk licensing. So it's the same red envelope that you guys are used to. You have the option to still use the old licensing. So you can pick and choose. If you tell us, by default, we'll automatically give you the Factory Talk version. So if you need the other one, let us know. It will still work with all third-party stuff. It's just how we manage it. It's a little Factory Talk licensing manager that's always on your boxes. You can set it up from a server environment, have everybody point to it. As we start looking at this, now that we're on version 11, you'll have your HMI server, your remote desktop box, your ThinManager server that might be licensed. And all it means is it doesn't matter how many Factory Talk View SC client I'm putting on monitors. Like I said, I can support up to 7 4K monitors on this thing, it's one license. One ThinManager license and one FactoryTalk View client. Now, I can't say the same thing if you start launching Wonderware or something like that. That's on them. But at least on our side of it. The other really nice thing that they did is when we're talking about the thin client environment where Mike is, if you log in and you're using the same licensing or the username and password that you do for the domain, it will now get passed through all the way from the thin client environment all the way to the FactoryTalk View client. So you only have to do a single sign-on on one spot. So in most cases, what you had to do in the past is you logged into the thin client, and then you still had to log into the software that you were using because they're kind of separate. Because if it's on the Rockwell side of it, we'll push that all the way through. Liar. So you can, it depends on what you're trying to do. So FactoryTalk View SE is pixel-based. So you do define what the resolution is, what your X and Y axis are. You have two options. You can either launch it with what's called FactoryTalk Viewpoint. So if you've seen that, that's an HTML5 conversion of the existing screens. And that'll make it an HTML5 side of it. The other option is to push it into Thin Client, because once it's displayed on the Thin Client side of it through ThinManager, at that point, you can then start doing this. Right. So one of the things that you'll notice once we get into the demo that you're showing there, those are essentially 4 applications that are running at like 1280 by something. But based off what you decide, it'll scale it down to whatever size format you want. When it comes to a phone, whether it's an Android or an Apple phone, it will just launch to the size that you're doing there, and you'll have the full environment of being able to do kind of multi-touch. We traditionally, so it is an application that launches on a Windows environment. Traditionally, we'll do install it on a remote desktop box. It doesn't have to be there. So it doesn't have to be on its own, I guess is what I'm saying. It can be on the HMI server, but the only reason I caution that is if you lose the HMI server, you also lose your ThinManager session to the clients. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So as you start getting into a bigger system, we traditionally have the HMI server and the ThinManager and terminal server separate. But you can. There's nothing against it, especially for smaller systems. You did it to me again. There you go. When you take focus away from it, this no longer works. So this will kind of go to your question as far as where do you co-locate stuff. So one of the things, and we've talked about it in the past here, but one of the things that we've done recently is, and we just did an update to this, we have virtual templates. So what we do is we provide you a hard drive with the actual Windows environment and the applications already pre-installed. Typically speaking, that's all part of our DCS Plant PX side of it. We normally do an HMI server, an engineering workstation, an operator client, historian, AssetCentre. All of them are separate Windows images. We now also have a consolidated image for a smaller subset type system. So the idea here is if you're talking about a control system, it doesn't have to be a DCS. We're going to put all the documentation as if it was a DCS. But we're looking at a control system environment that's 2,000 physical I/O points and less, no more than 10 clients, and I think it's up to about 5,000 historian points. We're sizing this to be launched on one box. The only thing that's not installed on it is ThinManager. Technically speaking, we would usually still want ThinManager installed somewhere else, but I can tell you from demo environments, it will work with launching it on the actual PASC server and it'd still be okay. So again, there's nothing against it. It just where you put all your eggs in one basket type idea is what you want to look at. So what this does, instead of a virtual template, this is actually running on an ISO file. So for anybody that's ever done that, an ISO file can be installed on a physical box. it would just replace your entire Windows environment with that ISO file. Basically, it's kind of like a full backup Cronus idea. You can also use this to generate a virtual image. So what you'll see is, if we were looking at this and we had one single consolidated pass, for anybody that hasn't seen pass from us, Process Automation System Server. In the past, it's usually just meant a nice HMI server. In this case, it has FactoryTalk View SE from the HMI environment, FactoryTalk Historian, FactoryTalk AssetCentre, and FactoryTalk VantagePoint. All of them are installed, including the Studio 5000 environment and all the development software. All of that is preloaded on that one box. So it's all working properly. You can vet that through your IT department. For anybody that has a toolkit, you can download it as part of your toolkit and use your toolkit license to activate it. So any of the virtual templates don't come with any Windows licensing, and it doesn't come with any Rockwell licensing. You guys have to put that on, whether it's for your own development or you're using that to develop for a customer. So either or. As long as you have a toolkit. If you don't have a toolkit, you can then buy it from us, essentially, and go to the website, and we provide you a part number and a license with the hard drive. So that's typically going to be for like an end user that wants to buy it for their own system.
SC, AssetCentre, Historian.
So it's the HMI server, Historian, the SQL interface that's there, and AssetCentre. All of that tied into one spot. So most of the demos that you'll see from us going forward, a lot of the times is all a single box. We dump it all in there. So what was that? I do hidden. I can send it to you. It's looking at least a minimum of about 4 vCPUs. So it's a pretty decent box and about 16 gigs of memory.
We have it. We put it. Just install it. I had it installed on a one of the new Stratus standalone backup boxes, which is 12.
That was 12 CPU.
VCUs.
So if you're looking at it, one of the kind of neater applications that we're looking at for this is if we put it all in one box, you can still connect to like I said, the 2,000 points of I/O. It's a single server system. Now, if your customer or you guys are looking at options, you can still do a full virtualized environment, whether it's Dell, HP, or even our own industrial data centers. Stratus has a couple of options. So if you guys saw the user group that we did a couple months ago, they have a little edge box called the ZTC Edge. That little guy, you can buy a single node or you can buy it redundant. That's enough to launch one PAS-C server. If you get the older PAS-C that we had, it was 2012. The latest one is 16.
Only on standard edition.
Only on standard.
The 16 and the 24 core.
So not on the data center license. But yes, that is a very big concern that you have. Kind of to my point. And not on the Express, but on the standard. So one of the things, just so you guys are aware also, is a lot of times, even if you do have a smaller system, you still ask, do I need redundancy? So you can still set this up as a redundant HMI server. Essentially, all we do is launch 2 of them. You would only use the Historian and AssetCentre on one of the boxes. So at that point, maybe you want to launch ThinManager on the other box or things of that nature. So you start looking at different setups there. But like I said, you can look at this for up to 10 view clients. And you can launch this, and actually Stratus has done a little bit of testing on the little ZTC Edge to do ThinManager with the PAS-C server. So if you have a larger environment, at that point, we wouldn't do this. We would do the individual ones, because once you're in a virtual environment, it's kind of easy to launch multiple images. But when you're talking about something consolidated, you got a smaller system, you're going onshore or offshore, a lot of the times you want to be able to kind of consolidate everything into 1 or 2 machines. At that point, that's when we start looking at this guy here. The 10 that we're showing there are by default just 10 clients, because whether they're virtualized, thin clients, whatever they might be, there's still 10 connections. So we're basically looking at it. That could be one thin client launching 10 clients on it. It's still 10 instances. So yeah, no cheating and putting like 5 clients on one monitor and then put a bunch of thin clients out there.
You know her well.
Yes. No, you can print the PDF all day long. As far as like just printing to, yeah, that and the other thing to look at if you're trying to print, there's a print screen function in all of the clients. So you can just enable that. As long as there's a printer established on the Windows environment, it'll automatically print to whatever you're trying to do. There's also, I think you can do the print to PDF. Do the other option. So the other thing just for that, so Vantage Point on the reporting side of it has an eventing feature so that you can take any reports that are there and send it via email, via PDF. So that might be another option. If they just want to be able to do those reports, no, it's not. Not if you're behind the DMZ. Because, yes. So Vantage Point can be installed both on the business network side and the control network side. So you can minimize the ports that are open. I focus on cybersecurity. That pretty much covers what we wanted to show, at least when it comes to discussion. Now I'm going to force David to work because he's got a couple of demos that we can show. So AssetCentre view and the ThinManager. Do you guys have any other questions of anything that we talked about, or maybe little tangents while he's setting up? At this point, you don't have to raise your hand. By the way, other people have to ask questions because it can't be them too. Yes and no. There's going to be a little bit of a caveat there. So what he's talking about is the plant PX or the process library objects. So right now we're on version 4.1 of the library set. It's plant PX system release 4.6. They're not one and the same, but essentially the process library objects are all the AOIs that get launched inside of the Studio 5000 environment. And then the HMI also has their own kind of faceplates that tie into those objects. You can do updates while everything's online and make modifications. The issue that you run into is from a ThinManager environment and everything else, it doesn't care. Because at that level, you're just providing it content. If you make modifications to the library set, if you're doing upgrades, in most cases, it doesn't cause issues. The problem is usually when you're making modifications and making changes. So, because the AOIs, as everybody knows here and has glared and yelled at me, we can't make modifications with AOIs online. You can overwrite or do changes to an AOI, you just can't replace them. And you can't make modifications inside of the code. So if you take it from a 4.0 to a 4.1 version and replace everything on it, it will automatically replace everything. And as long as the points don't change on the HMI side of it, all of that will still work. Your issues that you have to do is make sure that you're matching the 4.1 image set, let's say, on the controller to the 4.1 faceplates that would exist on the HMI so that you don't have any wireframing issues and things of that nature. It can be done. I would not recommend it, but it can be done. So the other part that I would argue with that, and I know where you're coming from on that one, because it's a process system, there are times where there's no need to upgrade. There's no reason to go away from a 3.6 library to a 4.0 library just because. Most of the time, it's a feature set side of it. Patching is usually either on the security side or anything else. The way that the screens look are usually outside of that scope. But if the argument is we need to do all of this, as long as you can update both of them from the server side of it and probably test it offline first, you can do all of that while you're online. As long as the controller is redundant. Is usually like if you need to do firmware upgrades and stuff like that. If it's just the AOIs, you can do it all online and you don't run into any issues. Yes, actually the system release 4.6 of Plant PX is all based off version 11 and version 31 of Studio 5000. Yes. Yeah, you can always move up. It's the other way that's an issue.
We're going to get ready to start our demos, but one thing I want to let you know, next month's topic, we're going to talk migration solutions. We're actually going to have some new stuff to show. We've been talking for years. We wanted you to migrate all the PLC 5s, and you guys have done a good job about that, but now it's time to start hitting the SLCs. So we're going to cover some new product, new, you've never seen before product at that meeting. So give you some more ammo to go after that old slick business. And we'll also talk about some of the new migration. We do have Micrologix migration to Micro 800. We're going to talk about all that. So we'll have our invite for that out probably in the next 2 weeks.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Wow, okay. Okay. All right, so I promise to be brief. I know we're almost approaching 1 o'clock, but just wanted to show a little bit of product today too, to coincide with our discussions. What I'm running right now is a cloud-based demo. So if you guys, if you don't want to install an AssetCentre system, but you'd like to play with one, this is one of the cloud-based demos that would be available to you guys. If you're interested in running it, just let us know. Rockwell has a nice cloud-based system. There's 20, 25 different demos that we have. There's several on AssetCentre, and so this is just one of them. So just let us know when we can spin it up for you, and we can run multiple instances and different kind of things. So what we're looking at here is an AssetCentre client, and this is a really small system. So essentially, all we have is one controller and one HMI system. So it's very simple. So this is a total of 2 assets. It may be difficult for you to see. This is my ACD file. So this is my Studio 5000 project. I'm going to tread lightly because this demo is more suited for factory talk, and I've crashed it several times. So I'm going to tread real softly on the Studio 5000. But Studio 5000, that was probably one of the earliest support for AssetCentre. What's new that we've talked about today is the deep integration with Factory Talk View SE, and so that's what this asset is here. So if I'm a user, I can right-click on the asset, I can check it out. So we talked about that concept. If I check it out, I check out this version. I can do I can do what I need to do on it, and then I check it back in. There's also other things you can do. You can get the project, and that's more of like an override feature. If you need to circumvent the check-in, check-out, if you're an administrator, we talked about that some today. So et cetera, et cetera. So that's your use. So if I check it out, I can right-click. I can check it out. It asks me to make a comment. I click OK. I can get a local copy. I can do all my things, and then I can check it back in at a later date or later time. So that's kind of the user interface. Now, if I can go into the design mode, I click design, and I see all my assets down here that I can add. So the question earlier, is it just Rockwell? It's not. There's other things like ABB robots and FANUC robots and different things. But these are all the different items I can add. And so with Factory Talk View SE, the latest version is now fully integrated. So you can see that down there on the list. And I happen to have my schedule tab open here. So if I click on any of these assets, notice I have a controller and an HMI scheduled. So the schedule means I can schedule a certain time that I do a back, and the event here, you may not be able to see, but this says backup and compare. If I click on the HMI here, and I want to do a compare right now, I can just hit the run now button, and that will initiate my going out, looking at the directory, grabbing the files, doing a compare, and then creating a report. And that takes a few minutes, so I'm not going to wait for that to finish. But
in most cases, what you'll do there is if you're setting a backup and comparison function once a week, if you know somebody's going to go and do work on a specific item, whether it's an MOC process or whatever it might be, you don't necessarily have to run the entire schedule, or you don't have to wait until the week goes in. You can just go in and say run now. So you can set this up based off where everything is located.
Okay, so we're running there. Some more things to see. I can click on my logs tab, or I can, try to. Fingers crossed. Again, this is a cloud system, so we keep our fingers crossed. So here's my log, so I can get all my information here. I can click on anything and see.
Go to the audit log next to it.
Yeah.
So the event log that you'll see there is going to be based off the diagnostics. So that's kind of your system information. Are you healthy? Is there something going on? Are you doing a backup? Did you find a comparison? The audit log is more based off the actual environment. So who's making modifications, who's tying into changing the set points, all of those information pieces that you're doing there. If you try to log in and you fail, it will also track who's trying to log in that they failed.
And this is the information that is now available on Trend Pro as well, correct? Yeah, so then we'll look at that in a minute or two. So what else? So we have, we can also click on archive. And so here's my archives. Give it a second to update.
And one thing to keep in mind is the assets that you're tying into to be able to do the back and compare do not have to be local. So we have quite a few systems right now that we're looking at pipelines where all of the assets are through a microwave or wireless. The connection to the device itself doesn't have to be high bandwidth. The only caveat with that is the AssetCentre server, the agent, and the client all have to be on the same network, not behind firewalls. But when it comes to the assets, those can be behind firewalls all day long, because all that we're opening up is the TCP/IP port for the Rockwell communication. So it's that one port just to be able to tie into every single one of those units. And at that point, we've been able to do 5 to 1,000 units all throughout the Permian and a couple other places when you start talking about being able to just touch and make sure that there's getting the backup into one central location.
Okay, so on the archive, notice it just counts up the versions here. I didn't have to create a new name for it, like we said in the presentation. So if I want to go from version 9 to version 7, I want to open version 7, I can right-click on it. I can select Show an Application Export Window. And go ahead. And so I can export the whole application, but I can also export pieces of that application. So I can click on inside the server name, the little ellipses there. There it goes. So I can go into quite a bit of detail on all the different types of files and all this. So if I only want to export the screens, or if I only want to export the database or the alarm setup, or et cetera, you can really kind of parse that out if you're really looking. If you want to look at something that you did a long time ago that maybe you overwrote, this is where you would do that in a lot more finely tuned sort of way.
And the other thing that's really important to look at is there's a little checkbox there that says export the factory talk directory. So a lot of the times when we were doing a backup of the HMI, we would always forget the directory. We always did the HMI, which has all the screens, the data connections, the alarm and events. But then we try to re-put that onto another computer system, and you don't have the username, security, all the policies. So now this will automatically do a backup of the factory talk directory at the same time that it does the HMI. So that's a really important step that most people, unfortunately, I made the mistake multiple times.
Yeah, so there we are. Okay, so, all right, so that was, that's basically it. I mean, that's, we're not doing a full demo, but that's basically what the new stuff in AssetCentre looks like. The other piece that we'd like to show with a few minutes left is FactoryTalk View SE version 11. So that's what we're looking at here. And let me go to the right screen. So this is just the overview screen. I think I'm going to jump right into Trend Pro. So we talked about that. That's probably one of the biggest additions to version 11, and we should see some data publishing. Okay, so so this is our trend. As you can see, there's also alarms and events that are on the trend in real time. So I thought this was a nice addition to a real-time analog trend, is the ability to overlap events directly onto it. And then you see down here, I believe, are some of the audits, the audit database that is linked directly to AssetCentre on the trend window itself. And like we said before, we added the AssetCentre. We also added OSI Pi as a data source directly into this tool. So if you had an enterprise data that you wanted to look at the View SE HMI, you can do that. In addition to live data and the Rockwell historian as well.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this in passing, but I didn't really focus on it. One of the options that you also have in FactoryTalk View 11 is you can now do production events. So there's an alarm and event server, if you guys have ever seen that. Typically that was for your alarms. So now what you can also do is if anybody's ever asked to be able to do kind of an audit log of who's going in, what button pushes are happening, and you didn't have AssetCentre, you pretty much needed to try to dump everything into historian or a data log. Now what you can do is for those simple events, so whether it's somebody turning something on, boiler turning on, push buttons, digitals, you can now set those up. Instead of being alarms, you can just assign them inside of AssetCentre or alarm and events as an event. So a production event, and that can be brought into the trend. So now you no longer necessarily need AssetCentre if that's all the functionality that you need. AssetCentre will still go above and beyond because it's going to track everything. But if you're just doing some simple little audits and you wanted to do everything encapsulated, this will now do it in one trend environment. You said no more.
Trend Pro looks interesting, improvements that you've made as far as being able to see some of the diagnostics. Do you anticipate that the Trend Pro itself will be positioned with gadget type use for edge IoT devices?
So Trend Pro itself, probably not necessarily, but we are looking at different avenues. So we've gotten into the analytics space. So we have some IoT plays that are going in. We have some other functionality. So if you guys have seen kind of the portfolio, there's now a FactoryTalk Innovation Suite. So for anybody that has gone to Automation Fair last year, it was kind of prevalent all over the place. We have an entire suite that ties in with the FactoryTalk side that gets into more of the IoT, whether it's edge analytics or more of the data center side of it. We're putting a lot of those tie-ins on that side of it where you can kind of do the applet idea. So once you get your data set and you want to orchestrate the data, you can kind of pick and choose what you want to display at. And then if you wanted to do Python or R, any of that, we will have some of those tie-ins on the HMI side on the local. We're going to have to define how far we want to go into opening it up into this side of it to tie in. Right, because and realistically, right, yeah, because OSI Pi, we partner with them, so we handle the site-based side and everything kind of downstream, where they handle usually more of the enterprise side of it, which is where our kind of analytics package plays more more in line with the topper end side. So we're pretty much doing everything that OSI Pi does on the top end side, and we're limiting when we start talking about, we have the Historian SE, and then we also have Historian ME that sits inside of the chassis. That's the other kind of option that we have there.
The nice thing about having an asset framework, the asset center, be the central point for this, is you're actually managing assets at that point. Really what the extra life is.
Right.
Another connection, different type of connections to asset data.
Yeah. Because basically, once you get into the IoT and the edge side of it, all you're trying to do is send data from everything that's there, decide on something, and usually have a single piece of information stream that you're sending out. Where if you're doing everything at Asset Center and Historian from a local side of it, then all I have to do is send over the single stream of data that I want. So I am doing everything at the edge. It just depends on what your infrastructure looks like.
Really sustainable the asset center. And native as well as internal asset. That's rather than having another piece of software.
Exactly.
And another piece of framework that you're already affected. That's one of the IoT pitfalls, I think, is you have too many layers of information transfer or used by something that's really relatively simple and scalable, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so that's in a nutshell the demo for Asset Center that we have here online. We also have on the desk here we have our ThinManager demo, and apologize for the folks that are online because it's not connected to my computer. But this is a kind of a ThinManager demo that we have that we can move and we can take the customer sites and et cetera. But this is all sort of an all-in-one encompassing. Oh, I've got an echo all of a sudden.
Oh, that's me.
Oh, are you sharing? Do I need to share?
I shared. Now I'm trying to figure out how to get.
Mute your laptop, maybe. Could try that. Is it gone? No.
Don't you love technology?
Yes, I do. So anyway, I may just turn off my microphone. And
I think that worked.
So with the ThinManager demo, we've got a tiny little server back here that's running 4 images. They were, so what you see here is essentially what we have on the screen. So we have, this is an example of, not tiling, what's the other?
Virtual screening.
Virtual screening. With multiple sources. And so the way this would work, I believe, is we have a main screen that's asset. And anytime you click on any of these screens on the right, then it will populate the main center. But these are all active screens at one time. So I can do
I think I've shown, this is a little bit of movie magic for the people over here. This is running on my laptop versus that one, just because we wanted to be able to show the people online. All I'm running is the newer PlantPX library set that we were talking about. So that's the 4.1 process library. There's a sample code that's inside of that. I'm just running it off of Emulate. The other ones are FactoryTalk View SC applications. So if any of you have ever installed FactoryTalk View SC, there's always an option for InstaFizz. So you've probably seen that multiple times. InstaFizz already comes with a little application that you can run. It's just running all Emulate. So essentially my server setup is about 4 emulated controllers on a Windows virtual image. And I'm also cheating a little bit because this is a virtualized thin client. So it's all on VMware. So if I look at the overall environment, this is my Windows box. So I'm running ThinManager. I'm currently running the full client on there, so I can do your standard install of your client, or you can do the virtualized thin client environment, because from a Rockwell point of view, it's the exact same thing. I don't care where I'm launching the client. It could be Windows, it can be thin client, I can do multiple. And when I'm looking at my ThinManager environment, all that's doing is sitting on top of it. It's a graphical interface, and I'm essentially configuring 3 main pieces of data. Where I'm getting the information from, So Mike showed it at the very beginning where the content is coming from. I will have my remote desktop boxes. So that could either be a full terminal server, remote desktop box, or it could be just my HMI server. HMI server, engineering workstation, any computer that's on your network. All you need to do is give it the credentials. So I create a connection to the backend side of it. If it's the Wonderware box, I just need the credentials to the Wonderware box. I don't care where I'm getting the data, as long as it's on the network. Cameras, any type of IP camera, there's a list from ThinManager on our Rockwell website that says everything that we can connect to. So I think it's like motion, JPEGs, and a bunch of other stuff. So there's a little IP camera that we launch on that guy, so you can see the real-time information. And then VNC server. So all of our panel views, whether it's the panel view 5500 or it's the 6 and 7 panel view plus, have VNC enabled. They will be disabled by default. So you have to enable that feature set, but there's no licensing that goes with it. Once you enable it, I can grab it from ThinManager and I can mirror the copy of your panel view on a thin client environment. So whether that's a tablet, a phone, or a full thin client, you're able to see all of it. And you can do click, point, do everything that's there. The other option is the display clients. Once I have connection into the server or to the computer, what do I want to launch inside of it? So think of the little calculator app that runs on the computer. If I want to just give you the calculator, I just give you the calculator. If I just want to give you the FactoryTalk View application, I only give you that. In most cases, I'm not providing the Windows environment to the operators. Now, there's a huge benefit, because if I go to that screen and close the client, there's just a black screen behind it. It will automatically log itself back in after a few seconds if it sees that the application closed. So the clients, the operators can never go in and start playing solitaire. The last thing that you're setting, and like I said, you're defining the client, you're defining the device. I can set my profiles here, and what I'm looking at is under this wired profile. So what David said is I had the virtual screening. I set up a little profile and it showed me every single one of these little boxes. So if I go through this, it shows me the definition of what I was looking at. So those little 5 boxes that are the same ones that are there, what I have in each one of them, what the size resolution, so if it's a 4K monitor versus just a standard HD, tells me exactly how big something is. And then I can kind of pick and choose which one I want. And the little gray box, if you guys can see it, is defining which one I'm looking at. So by default, when this guy launches up, what do I want to display there? And it can come from the exact same server, or it can come from multiple. So all I did was define a bunch of different setups. And then I think my main, we prefer it that way. It doesn't require it, but it's usually Active Directory. You set that up in the policies of FactoryTalk. So by default, you're doing by the device. So you set up the MAC addresses. You can do pass forward where you don't care about the MAC addresses. You just care as long as you can hit the IP address and the username. So once you have this set up, you can kind of mix and match. If I needed to make any changes to this, I can simply just go to the client, right click on it and restart it. If I restart the terminal, I'll go back to my little virtual thin client. It killed the session off because it's restarting the virtual thin client. And essentially what I'll do is within 30 seconds, it launches everything back up. So if I was to make any type of configuration changes, you can do that from a maintenance box, push all of your changes out into the field, and all it does is it automatically restart. The only time that you have to physically go to the unit and reswap over is if you're doing a full firmware upgrade to those. And all that is it's going to take a little longer. So you can still do the restart from the main box, but instead of 10 seconds, it might take 20 seconds. And again, the main idea here is if I'm doing something at the thin client environment and I'm typing something in and the box itself dies, I take another one out of the box, pop it in, it'll automatically get the same configuration, same IP address, and you can go back to typing. That's about it, guys. You are welcome to come play. You are welcome to ask more questions, as long as you keep my booty. Everybody online, I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to me. Quick show of hands. How many of you guys are actually thinking about going to Automation Fair? We got one. Is it? Nobody else is going to Automation Fair?
Chicago is beautiful in November.
Considering the weather right now, it might still be hot. Are you going to go to PSUG or are you just going to go to Automation Fair?